5 life delays from narcissists that only unfold in your 50s. There are losses you can see immediately when you are entangled with a narcissist. The insults cut quickly, the control suffocates visibly, and the constant erosion of your confidence is painfully clear. These wounds sting, and they are easier to identify because they bleed in real time. But psychologists remind us that the most devastating consequences of narcissistic abuse are not always the obvious ones. The subtler losses, the ones that creep in silently, so insidiously that they feel almost invisible, are far more corrosive. These are not wounds you notice in your 20s or even your 30s. Instead, they are like toxins seeping into your life in slow motion, until decades later you awaken in your 40s or 50s to realize that entire chapters of your life have been stolen. This is when hopelessness sets in, when the grief of lost time, lost opportunities, and stolen growth crashes down, leaving you staring at a future that feels shorter and a past you can never reclaim. Psychologists often describe this stage as grief with no funeral, the mourning of a self you were never allowed to become. The first of these hidden losses is what many clinicians refer to as the growing up delay. Developmental psychologists stress that the natural path of adolescence and young adulthood involves trial and error, taking risks, failing, recovering, and slowly crafting an authentic identity. It is in those years that most people learn how to self-regulate, how to trust their instincts, and how to develop resilience through lived experience. But when someone encounters a narcissist very young, sometimes even in childhood if it is a parent, or in early adulthood through a romantic partner, this process is hijacked. Instead of maturing through freedom and mistakes, survivors are forced to mature through fear and control. Instead of exploring who they are, they learn to walk on eggshells. Instead of building confidence, they develop elaborate coping strategies designed only to avoid punishment. Psychologists call this arrested development, a phenomenon where emotional growth freezes because survival takes precedence over exploration. Tragically, the victim often believes this is normal. To them, love feels indistinguishable from endurance. As the years slip by, the consequences deepen. Survivors in their 30s and 40s often report in therapy that they feel like strangers to themselves, describing their personalities not as natural identities but as costumes stitched together from fear and compliance. Dr. Carol McBride, a leading psychologist in the study of narcissistic abuse, notes that survivors frequently enter midlife with the emotional maturity of someone much younger, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never given the safe space to develop autonomy. Decisions feel overwhelming because they were always made under coercion. Independence feels terrifying because it was never practiced. Social settings can feel alien, like being a child awkwardly placed in an adult's world. The devastating realization emerges in therapy sessions when clients admit through tears, "I don't know who I am," and psychologists affirm that this confusion is not a flaw but the direct byproduct of years spent surviving someone else's domination. The second loss is what might be called the knowing yourself delay. Identity, according to psychologists, is forged not just by introspection but by lived experience. People come to know themselves through trial and error, by exploring careers, traveling, experimenting with hobbies, falling in love, losing love, and slowly piecing together their values and desires. It is this experimental freedom that allows us to say, "This is who I am." But in a relationship with a narcissist, that freedom is stolen. Instead of exploring your own interior world, your life becomes a study of theirs. Survivors often develop an almost hyperclinical knowledge of the narcissist's moods. They know what ignites rage, what calms it, what brings fleeting approval, and what triggers explosive rejection. Clinical psychologist Dr. Ramoni Dervasula often explains that this hyperattunement is a survival mechanism rooted in trauma bonding. The brain, wired to avoid danger, becomes obsessively focused on monitoring the abuser's inner state at the expense of the victim's own identity. But the cost of this hypervigilance is profound. Survivors emerge years later realizing they have no idea what brings them joy. Ask them what hobbies they love, and they hesitate, because every attempt at self-expression was either criticized or mocked. Ask them what food they enjoy, and they second-guess themselves, because even the smallest preferences were invalidated. Ask them about the kind of partner they want, and they look blankly, because their definition of love has been entirely shaped by survival, not intimacy. Psychologists call this the erasure of self, a condition where the individual's authentic preferences and values have been suppressed so long that they are unrecognizable even to themselves. This is why, after leaving, many survivors feel lost and disoriented, not because they are weak, but because they have never been given the privilege of self-discovery. The loss is not just of years but of the fundamental knowledge of who they are. And yet, as grim as these delays are, psychologists emphasize that recovery is possible. The work is neither fast nor easy. It involves grieving the years lost, which therapists say is a real and necessary mourning. But healing also involves reclaiming the developmental stages that were stolen. Therapy provides a safe environment where survivors can experiment with identity, rediscover preferences, and slowly take the risks that were once forbidden. Self-exploration exercises, journaling, mindfulness, and trauma-informed counseling all play crucial roles in rebuilding an authentic sense of self. Most importantly, psychologists stress the power of community, connecting with other survivors who affirm that what happened was abuse, not love, and that the disorientation is not madness but a predictable wound. The delays created by narcissists are devastating not because they simply waste time, but because they rob survivors of the natural unfolding of life. Yet with awareness, support, and therapeutic guidance, it is possible to restart the journey. Psychologists remind us that identity can be rebuilt at any age, that emotional growth is not bound by the calendar, and that healing is less about recovering what was lost and more about creating what was denied. The realization that decades have been stolen is heartbreaking, but it can also become the very moment survivors reclaim authorship of their lives, no longer defined by fear but by freedom. The third and perhaps most sobering delay is what psychologists often call the health delay. If there is one arena where narcissistic abuse leaves an indelible scar, it is on the body. Long-term exposure to what clinicians describe as toxic stress functions like a corrosive agent, subtle at first, but devastating over time. At the beginning, you might only notice minor symptoms. A restless night here, an anxious stomach there, the occasional racing heartbeat that you brush off as nothing. But as Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, explains, when the nervous system is forced to live in perpetual high alert, the body begins to store trauma like a poison. The narcissist's inherent antagonism, whether manipulative, critical, or overtly hostile, creates an environment where each request is a delicate balancing act, where a misstep could trigger punishment, shame, or withdrawal of support. The toxic behaviors you must endure in these moments can vary widely. Sometimes it is blatant, in-your-face hostility. "Oh, so you really need me now, huh?" Other times, it is punitive reminders of past perceived slights. "I'll help this time, unlike when you didn't bail me out." Occasionally, it is insidious, like manipulative texts that require careful navigation to avoid retaliation. Psychologists describe these dynamics as chronic stressors, activating the sympathetic nervous system and keeping the victim in a heightened state of vigilance. In essence, your nervous system is constantly scanning for threats while simultaneously attempting to secure the aid necessary for survival. Desperation demands strategy. You may need to hold your tongue, swallow your responses, or fluff the narcissist, an active, conscious form of fawning that psychologists distinguish from unconscious trauma responses. Fluffing entails praising, thanking, and placating the abuser while ignoring toxic behavior, sometimes making promises you do not intend to keep, all to ensure the crisis is navigated successfully. Interestingly, research in trauma psychology shows that many survivors engaged in this behavior long before they understood the narcissist's true personality, meaning that much of their early life interactions were already colored by a subconscious negotiation for safety. Over time, this creates a pattern in which nearly every interaction carries a subtle tinge of desperation, whether the crisis is minor or significant. Ironically, the very strategies you deploy to survive can make you feel complicit, manipulative, or fake. Psychologists note that this internalized shame is a common feature in trauma survivors, stemming from cognitive dissonance. You are forced to behave in ways that contradict your authentic self in order to preserve safety or resources. The mind interprets these survival behaviors as moral failings, even though they are adaptive responses to impossible circumstances. Survivors may feel guilt, self-loathing, or a sense of complicity simply for engaging with someone abusive, intensifying the psychological burden of what researchers call survival subjugation, a state in which the victim's agency is compromised by necessity rather than choice. This dynamic can evoke powerful secondary emotions: bitterness, resentment, anger, disgust, and a sense of stuckness. Psychologists emphasize that these feelings are natural and justified. They arise from the tension between your moral compass and the practical need to navigate a hazardous interpersonal landscape. The anger at yourself or the world is a response to the absence of support, the inequities of circumstance, and the repeated necessity of placing survival above self-expression. It is not a failure, it is evidence of navigating an environment that is, by design, coercive. Within this crucible, survival sometimes requires radical acceptance. This is the psychological skill of recognizing reality as it is in the moment and aligning one's responses to that reality without expectation of change in the abuser. Whether that means sitting silently as they insult you, effusively thanking them, or carefully choosing not to take the bait, these strategies are not signs of weakness. They are conscious, strategic choices rooted in self-preservation. Trauma-informed psychologists emphasize that without this awareness, victims are prone to over-apologizing, attempting to evoke empathy, or engaging in fruitless negotiations for change, which only amplifies stress and re-traumatizes the survivor. Ultimately, navigating a crisis while relying on a narcissist is a delicate dance between strategy and survival, between holding on to your integrity and protecting yourself from further harm. Understanding these dynamics through the lens of psychology allows survivors to recognize that their behaviors are adaptive, not indicative of personal failure, and provides tools to endure crises while planning for autonomy and eventual recovery. Awareness, intentionality, and radical acceptance become shields, allowing the survivor to endure the immediate storm without surrendering their long-term potential for growth and freedom. When you are trapped in relationships with narcissists or others who consistently harm you, survival often demands a level of strategic thinking that feels uncomfortable, even morally ambiguous. Psychologists studying trauma and relational abuse emphasize that these scenarios, whether with a friend, family member, partner, or colleague, require a chloride assessment of reality. The moment you recognize the dynamics at play and hold the true north of your objective in mind, whether that is safety, completing an urgent task, or averting crisis, you can act with intention rather than reactive panic. The stakes feel higher when the task directly affects survival, health, or immediate well-being, because the body's stress responses are fully activated. Your nervous system is alert, your adrenaline may spike, and your ability to think clearly is constantly challenged by the tension between danger and necessity. Some may hear the word strategic and immediately think of Machiavellian manipulation, using someone's vulnerabilities to exploit them. Trauma-informed psychologists are careful to distinguish survival strategy from intentional exploitation. In these moments, you are not seeking to harm or take advantage of the narcissist. You are attempting to preserve yourself. If the narcissistic person refuses, you may seek alternatives, but in the moment of crisis, the only available path may be through the very person who poses a threat to your well-being. A Machiavellian approach, by contrast, is calculated to exploit weaknesses for personal gain. What the survivor is doing is rooted in necessity, not intent to dominate. Psychologists note that acting strategically under duress is a protective response, a way to minimize harm while securing what is essential. Yet even with strategic intent, the emotional toll is real and significant. Survivors report feelings of sadness, revulsion, anxiety, exhaustion, and shame after relying on someone who has harmed them. Psychologists describe this as secondary trauma, the stress that arises from navigating the ongoing abuse while performing acts that feel morally uncomfortable. There is often a fear that this repeated reliance may reinforce the fawn response, a learned survival mechanism in which the victim appeases the abuser to avoid punishment. The chronicity of such situations, where one must repeatedly engage with narcissistic individuals, can make these survival behaviors feel like a permanent, inescapable pattern. This leads to heightened vigilance, self-doubt, and rumination about morality and authenticity. Awareness, however, is the key to disentangling the trauma from the strategy. Psychologists highlight that recognizing why you must engage, because immediate action is required to prevent harm or crisis, reduces the risk of reinforcing maladaptive fawning behaviors. Instead of internalizing guilt or labeling oneself as manipulative, you can reframe these actions as tactical responses to a constrained environment. The real harm lies in the sense of entrapment, the perception that there is no escape. Being stuck in this dynamic activates a cascade of negative emotions: frustration, self-loathing, resentment, and a pervasive sense of injustice. Trauma researchers note that these feelings are natural, valid, and indicative of the tension between one's moral compass and survival needs. Life, as psychologists repeatedly remind us, is rarely fair. The cruel irony is that sometimes the very people we must rely on to navigate crises are the ones who have harmed us, and they often leverage this dependence to extract future favors or maintain control. In these moments, you may feel physically and emotionally contaminated, as if the abuse lingers like a stench you cannot wash away. Cognitive distortions can emerge, causing self-blame: I should not have asked for help, this is my fault. Psychologists stress that understanding these reactions as normal trauma responses can help survivors externalize the blame and protect their mental health. Strategic engagement, uncomfortable as it may be, is often the safest path forward. Once the immediate crisis passes, survivors are encouraged to explore long-term solutions that reduce dependency, even if they require financial risk or personal sacrifice. Trauma-informed approaches emphasize autonomy and proactive problem-solving as ways to reclaim agency. Over time, survivors often find that completing tasks independently, despite exhaustion, is psychologically less costly than negotiating with manipulators who exploit every opportunity to control. Finally, maintaining focus on strategy rather than ego is crucial. Pride and self-image can easily cloud judgment when dealing with narcissistic individuals, but psychological research shows that focusing on achievable goals, on what is necessary to survive and protect oneself, enhances feelings of control and reduces secondary stress. Recognizing that you are not alone, that countless others navigate these same dynamics, can provide perspective and foster resilience. In essence, survival under these circumstances is not a reflection of weakness. It is a testament to the mind's remarkable ability to adapt and protect itself in the face of relational trauma. Sometimes in life, survival forces you to navigate treacherous waters, and the only refuge available is a stormy port. Psychologists studying trauma and relational abuse recognize that when survivors are forced to rely on people who have harmed them, whether family, friends, or colleagues, this act is rarely voluntary in the truest sense. It is a calculated necessity, a choice made under duress. When you make that choice, you may carry a lingering sense of regret, guilt, or shame. These feelings are understandable because humans are wired to internalize moral conflict. Cognitive dissonance arises when your actions to survive clash with your sense of right and wrong. Trauma experts explain that regret in this context is not a reflection of moral failure. It is the brain's emotional response to navigating impossible dilemmas where all options are risky. Yet, paradoxically, the alternative, refusing help, carries its own psychological burden. If the crisis worsens because you could not secure assistance, your mind will replay the what ifs, and psychologists call this anticipatory regret compounded by helplessness. Survivors are caught in a no-win situation. The very act of seeking help from someone harmful produces anxiety, self-doubt, and moral discomfort, while avoiding that person may jeopardize safety or critical outcomes. In this sense, psychologists frame these moments not as moral failure but as survival strategy under extreme constraint, highlighting the distinction between ethical intention and circumstantial necessity. The harsh reality of narcissistic dynamics in crisis is that there is no elegant solution, no way to navigate the situation that leaves you unscathed emotionally. Narcissistic individuals exploit dependence and amplify vulnerability, which intensifies feelings of powerlessness and trappedness. Trauma researchers note that this lack of a win scenario is central to the psychological impact of these relationships. Survivors must contend simultaneously with immediate practical needs and the long-term erosion of autonomy and self-esteem. Understanding this, psychologists advise cultivating radical acceptance, a conscious acknowledgement that the situation is unfair, yet that your response can still be intentional. By framing survival as a temporary and strategic engagement rather than moral compromise, survivors can mitigate self-blame, protect mental health, and plan for longer-term autonomy once the immediate crisis passes. Ultimately, the lesson here is both sobering and empowering. Psychologists emphasize that recognizing the impossibility of a perfect solution can paradoxically free survivors from the cycle of guilt and shame. Survival in these moments is not weakness, it is adaptive resilience. By acknowledging the emotional cost while maintaining strategic focus, you preserve both your safety and your agency. You may regret the circumstances, but the act of survival is a profound testament to human ingenuity and the mind's remarkable capacity to navigate relational danger without losing oneself entirely.